California, Washington State, and Oregon in the United States are experiencing massive wildfires, and that the smoke from these wildfires is currently being seen in parts of Western Europe, in Portugal and Spain and Ireland, in parts of England. And it seemed to me a really appropriate metaphor, if a metaphor is what it is, for what we're talking about today. Because on the one hand, we have a domestic issue. We have something happening in the United States that is affecting not only the United States, but now Europe, countries thousands of miles away. California, Washington State, and Oregon in the United States are experiencing massive wildfires. And that the smoke from these wildfires.
I think, Jonathan, maybe you have opened the
Western Europe,
the platform.
Spain and Ireland.
This is start the broadcasting right now.
Seems to me a really appropriate metaphor. I didn't touch anything, so what do you need me to do? For what we're talking about today. Because on the one hand, we have a
do you have your computer platform open? I mean the player open, because it should be broadcasting right now in the platform.
So I'm hearing myself talk on a loop right now. Washington State and Oregon in the United States are experiencing massive wildfires. And that the smoke from these wildfires.
I think, Jonathan, maybe you have opened the
Western Europe,
platform.
Spain and Ireland. We have a platform open. I didn't touch anything, so what do you need me to do? Whoever stop and start over.
Yeah, actually, just one sec.
You have your computer platform open. There. Just wait a sec, please. Right now in the platform.
I'm hearing myself on the tape right now. Washington State and Oregon in the United States are experiencing massive wildfires. And that the smoke from these wildfires, maybe open the platform. We have a platform open. I didn't touch anything, so what do you need?
Yeah, actually, just one sec.
Sorry about that, Jonathan. I think the person that was mothering from the technical part has the mic open, so we can restart now and continue. Sorry about that.
Just quickly, Alejandro, am I continuing or am I starting over?
I think it's better if you start over. You start over. Sorry about that.
No problem. Is that sharing now? I'm sure that's
Let's share screen.
Screen 2. And then we want to check the audio. Yeah, I'll get the audio. Are we good, Alejandro?
Yes, all good. So again, sorry about the inconvenience. Welcome again to all the students. We have had students since 8 a.m. So about 1 hour ago, visiting our fair. So the idea now is to talk with Dan and Jonathan, who's gonna tell us about fostering global leadership. It's all related with UN United model. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jonathan and Dan, for joining us, and please continue. Sorry about the inconvenience. That's okay. Don't worry.
Can you hear us, Alejandro?
Yeah, I'm hearing you.
Okay, excellent. I really apologize to everybody. This is the new world. One of the things we're talking about is how we are interconnected through technology. And yet technology seems to let us down all the time as well. So it's a fragile relationship. So I'm good to start over?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, yeah, my name is Jonathan Wright and I'm speaking to you from Waterloo Catholic here in Kitchener, Ontario. And I apologize if you heard me before, but I was suggesting that as I drove in today on the news, they were talking about how the wildfires in the United States, in California, Oregon, and Washington, the smoke had made its way all the way over to Western Europe, thousands of miles away. And it struck me that it becomes a great example of how the issues that one country has expand beyond borders. That in a very real, a very physical, and a very natural way, we are connected. But the more I thought about that, because it's a bit of a drive in and I had some time, it's more than just the wildfires. Because the wildfires are occurring because of dramatic changes in our climate. And those climate changes aren't only happening in California, Oregon, and Washington. 28%, there was a 28% increase in wildfires in the Amazon last year. And we talk about the Amazon as being the world's lungs. I mean, so much of the carbon dioxide in the planet is processed through that rainforest. And then we start thinking about, well, where are the people who are most often causing the issues that are prompting climate change? And in many cases, it's those countries that aren't the ones that suffer immediately. It's the people in countries that are more vulnerable economically, more vulnerable socially, more vulnerable politically. And it really does remind us, I would think, that this is a time to foster global leadership. To not think in terms of me, but to think in terms of we. To not think in terms solely of my nation, my community, but to think in terms of international concerns. And so it's in this increasingly internationalized world that the ability to encourage in students, the ability to engage with a variety of cultures and experiences, as well as to have high standards of academic excellence, is more important than ever. In a global society, knowledge alone is not enough. The practical application of that knowledge in a collaborative and an ever-changing setting is the holy grail that we as educators pursue. In the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, we call this global leadership. And by global leadership, we mean the ability to drive change across borders and between cultures. Our goal is for students to expand their awareness and their perspective through engaging experiences in and outside of the classroom. And so the Model United Nations program, which we'll speak about today, provides a really fun and accessible way to pursue these goals. And our graduates are a testament to this success. So today we'll just walk through a couple of items. I'll explain why me, why am I here talking today, why am I passionate about this topic. We'll discuss what is global leadership. We'll continue to explore why global leadership is important. We'll talk about how the United Nations as an institution can demonstrate that global leadership and how students, perhaps some of you already, who are participants in the Model United Nations, develop the skills for global leadership. We have a few of my students talk about their experience, and then we'll finish looking at the necessary skills for both global leadership and for participation in a Model United Nations, and what are some of those opportunities that are open to you. And so the question is, why me? I mean, I'm a teacher. I teach history and I teach international diplomacy at St. Mary's High School. But in high school, I spent much of my time as a participant in simulations, as a delegate to Model United Nations events. I played a lot of sports. I was in drama productions. I loved my classwork. But when I look back now, the thing that has formed me the most, that has given me the skills that allow me to teach, to chair simulations, to speak to you today, was my participation in the Model United Nations. It allows me to be a mentor for Model United Nations students. And I just had to put it in there because I don't know how long it lasts. As someone who grew up in the shadow of Anfield, Liverpool Football Club Stadium, I'm still basking in the afterglow of their first Premier League title. So good things do happen eventually. But to the business at hand, why global leadership? Well, we no longer have the luxury of thinking that local actions only in a country, do not have global consequences. Current events and indeed history have always reminded us that we are connected globally. But innovations in connectivity, from the telephone to satellites to the internet to social media to the Zoom calls, which hopefully we're getting right finally, and beyond, have accelerated and amplified the effect beyond anything that my 80-year-old father could have imagined when he was growing up in England during the Second World War. For him, the world was that place over there. Everything about his life was immediate. It was rooted. He had a sense of belonging in his local community. He had a sense of belonging in his city. He had a sense of belonging in his country, and nothing beyond that. The pandemic reminds us that's not true. The Globe and Mail is a local newspaper here in Canada, and on their Instagram, they were talking recently about how safe is your school. We've just returned to school here in Canada, but it looks and feels different in light of COVID-19. We're nervous to go back, and our lives don't look the same way that they used to, but we do have a general sense that we're managing. 50% of our classes are done online, 50% are done in person. I have students that I've taught so far this year through a platform like this. I won't see them face to face until October 1st. And so much of what we do is based on relationships. That's difficult, it's challenging, but at least we're safe. Our direct neighbor to the south, however, has an entirely different experience. They have over 175,000 deaths as a result of COVID. They have epicenters all across their country. They have no idea in many cases how to get students back to school. And their biggest argument seems to be whether or not American football will run at universities in the autumn. This has caused the longest land border in the world, the least guarded land border in the world, which has almost always through our history been open, to be largely closed. It split up families who crossed the border. It's inconvenienced greatly workers who worked across the border, and that's had a huge impact on our economies. And the political perspective of those two countries has never been more different. But it's not only North America. Colombia too suffers. But your experience is set against a much different cultural and economic and a political backdrop than Canada. The news reports tell us in Canada that there is a civic challenge in Colombia as unrest builds regarding the peace deal, union rights, Indigenous lives, and cuts to public education. You know so much more than I do or ever will about what it means to be a Colombian today. But I can only imagine the additional challenges and stressors that you live with when also trying to manage a pandemic that has taken over 21,000 lives. And still the impact is felt around the world. In Canada, as I mentioned, we've moved schools to 50% online learning. We've been able to provide poor families with computers and with internet access. And I understand that you're doing something similar. But in India, where a significant amount of a massive population of 1.3 billion live below the poverty line, such access is impossible. A country in which access to elementary public education was already a challenge for rural communities has now made access to learning a choice between risking one's life, and it is a risk, the health system can't keep up, or going to school. Individual domestic policies have an impact on the world's ability to respond. When one country is a hotspot, it brings risks for all, and brings risks not just in the spread, in this case of COVID-19, but in the allocation of global resources. In Western Africa, since the pandemic exploded outside of China's borders, so let's say February of this year, more people in Western Africa have died of measles, Ebola, and cholera than have died of COVID-19 the world over. And yet our global resources have been shifted to fight against coronavirus. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. You can be a globalist, someone who sees themselves as a part of a bigger world, what one of our former prime ministers, Stephen Harper, called an anywhere, a person who sees themselves as part of a broad community and can live anywhere. Or you can be a localist, someone who's deeply rooted in the community, someone like my father, someone who our prime minister would have called a somewhere. It's not about whether that's right or wrong, but in all cases, we have to recognize that there are massive international consequences. And the challenges continue. Some countries want to close borders, to protect their own, to isolate from the outside world. They see that national focus as the path to success. They want to claim a share of what they believe to be a finite amount of prosperity. They want to get theirs. They want to build walls. Others see the advantage of interconnectedness. It's their belief that when all of us, and especially the least amongst us, do prosper, then we all succeed. For them, prosperity isn't finite. There's not a fixed amount of resources over which we must fight, but rather, the better everyone does, then the more we grow the share of resources. They want to build bridges. Pope Francis here is the most notable. He's advocated for this for years, but it does illustrate the advantage of non-national points of view. Pope Francis speaks to a church of billions around the world. His faithful don't have borders in the same sense. And in fact, the Vatican State is not a full member of the United Nations. It's an observer. It's invited to the table to listen, but doesn't get to vote. And so what we see is there is something about our responsibility to our local communities, to our nations, that drives our approach. The UN, however, takes the view that we can do more and we can do better. And all of these challenges are set against the backdrop of global issues that begin, but certainly do not end with climate change, human rights, and racial justice. So how then does the United Nations demonstrate global leadership? The UN set its charter in 1945 in a world that was devastated by 2 world wars, a global pandemic, and a Great Depression. And we kind of feel those shadows today. Certainly we haven't had 2 world wars in our recent history, but the world is filled with conflict throughout. We are in the midst of a global pandemic, and many of the G7 nations are in the midst of an economic recession. If a second wave hits, many economists fear that they might be on the cusp of another Great Depression. But in 1945, the acceleration of global connection through transport, through trade, and through colonialism had shown an incredibly dark side. We'd witnessed the horrors of the death camps. We'd seen the rise of authoritarianism, and we stood and watched as atomic bombs were exploded in conflict. World leaders at the time hoped that providing a venue for collective security, for a dialogue between nations, and for international structures to enhance standards of living around the world might avoid similar recurrences. It hasn't always been the case. We can witness the Cold War. We can witness the challenges of poverty around the world, the victims of unrestrained capitalism. And in fact, the action, or more often the inaction of the United Nations, has certainly contributed to this discord and to this struggle. But it's the fundamental belief of the United Nations that we must have equality amongst nations, It's a minor point, so go with me into the weeds on this one. But in many committee meetings and many parliaments, governments the world over, I don't get to bring a motion unless I have a seconder. I need somebody who says that what I want to propose is important enough that it should come before the group. The United Nations doesn't require seconders when individual countries bring proposals. And the reason is that every one of its 193 member states has to be an equal partner. And the second that a country needs someone else to agree with them in proposing action, we limit their voice. The UN also, though, by the way, does this naturally. The last vestige of colonialism structurally in the United Nations is the Security Council, where the five, and I use the word hesitantly, victors of World War II have a veto power, despite the fact that Great Britain and France are really not seen as world powers, except in a historical sense anymore. But imperfect as it is, the United Nations has 5 principal aims that hold great promise when they're pursued with an openness to change and a willingness to share power and influence. And I'm the first one to say, those aren't easy conditions to be sure. The emphasis has shifted a little over the years, but the basic belief remains that if people have what they need, if their standard of living removes the nearness of death that comes with poverty, then the roots of conflict can be plucked out. If those roots, though, do take hold, if they remain and they begin to grow, then the United Nations believes that providing a venue for dialogue and discussion, for the promotion of international standards and international law, can cut that plant off before it blossoms into conflict. But the United Nations is also practical. And so it does believe that in a worst case scenario where that physical conflict erupts, that an international peacekeeping force can provide protection for the innocent citizens, the displaced persons, and the refugees who are so often the first and the constant victim. This isn't about peacemaking. This isn't about fighting wars on behalf of nations, but it is about recognizing that the most acute consequences are almost always felt first by the most vulnerable people. And it's to those people that we have the first responsibility. It's into this world that the Model United Nations delegate walks. It's in this world that they seek to develop their own capacity for global leadership. And I should just take a quick aside here for a second, because there's often a tendency to think of you, of students, of young people as the future. That if we can build the skills in you now, that maybe 20 years down the road, you can change the world. I had a priest a number of years ago who left our parish and went somewhere else. And I always remember the last thing he said to us, because it spoke to me as a teacher. He said, don't ever think that young people are the future of the church. Always remember that young people are the church now. You may not be Catholic, that may not mean anything to you. But when we approach the Model United Nations, we fundamentally believe that you are the world changers now, where you are, who you are, and with what you know. The goal of the Model United Nations is to help you refine those skills, to help you develop a greater capacity for global leadership, but not to give it to you. You have it already in your person and in your passion. And when we look at the state of the world right now, when I watch the protests that are all throughout Canada, America, Western Europe with regards to Black Lives Matter, the vast majority of people advocating for that change are young people. We failed you. Some of us did our best and we'll keep trying, but you are the change. So the student acting as a Model United Nations delegate then plays the role of one of the partners in the UN. As I mentioned, there are 193 member states and over 500 more non-governmental organizations. There are observers like the Vatican. There are lots of roles for delegates to play. And they all bring with them their own unique learning. Delegates research and they write position papers. They debate and they discuss in committees. They take decisions in crisis scenarios. A crisis scenario is a case study where we would sit in a room and all of a sudden, as a chair, I would say, there's been a disease outbreak in a particular country, or war has started between these two countries. And all of a sudden, you have to play the role of problem solving together, how to respond to that emergency. Delegates script resolutions, declarations, and conventions that respond to pressing real world issues. Now, it's not always that. Some of my favorites took fictional approaches. So Star Wars, if you've seen the movies, my young boy just watched them with me this summer and fell in love with Darth Vader, which I don't know if that says anything good or bad about him, but that's not the point. But I was part of a simulation once that took the same skills of a model United Nations delegate, but said at the end of the Battle of Yavin, at the end of Return of the Jedi, how do we rebuild a government that responds to the whole galaxy? It was entirely fictional, it was silly, and it got crazy. But the skills required were as much at play in that fun situation as they were in the other one at that same event that talked about access to fresh water in South Africa. Delegates represent fairly and accurately the political structures, the foreign and domestic policies, the cultural perspectives, and the economic interests of their delegation, which is most often a country. And it requires skill, diligence, and a great amount of self-confidence. I think of it this way. If you're an artist, if you're an actor, or if you're a sports person, the success is found in the preparation, not in the performance. I go back to my beloved Liverpool, Jurgen Klopp, the manager, says, games are just the things that happen. Our ability to win is what happens on the training pitch. It happens in the team room. It happens in the training facilities as the athletes exercise. The best delegates love the practice. And so I'm going to suggest that there are really 4 areas in which the Model United Nations delegate can continue to develop their capacity for global leadership. The first is academic skill. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but research, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication are the hallmarks of success, both in high school and at university, and I would suggest in a professional life. But it also builds an awareness of global engagement. I'm surprised very often how many students don't know the basic things that are happening in our country, let alone around the world. It's one of the ways technology has changed us. When I was going to high school, and I admit that's 28 years ago, so this is back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. If I wanted to listen to music, I turned on the radio. And every 20 minutes or so, the radio would stop playing music and someone would come on and give a short 4 or 5 minute news brief. They didn't go in depth. There wasn't a lot of detail, but there was a general sense of what was happening. And I was asking my students about that in the springtime. I just assumed people still listen to the radio because it's what I do. And they just laughed at me. They listened to Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube. Why would they be inconvenienced by stopping listening to what they want to hear by a news broadcast? It's a silly little thing, but it's fundamentally changed the way in which we engage with the world around us. So I asked them then, how do you know? Where do you get your information? And the vast majority said they got it from Instagram or TikTok. I said, really? So Twitter and tweets? And they just laughed at me, because apparently Twitter and tweets are years and years ago. It's always a good barometer for me. If I think it's cool and I've caught up to it, it's probably 10 years in the past. And so we have to think about how we engage. How do we move more deeply into this information? But one of the things one of my students pointed out with regard to Instagram is he said, yes, sir, but you watch BBC News and you listen to CNN and all of these other formal stations. He says 20 people get to decide what you hear before you hear it. He said, when I'm on Instagram and someone posts something, they are on the scene. I'm seeing what they're seeing. We've removed the barriers to that engagement. Now, as a teacher, I think that's terrific. I think there's a little danger because we need to be careful, right? We don't want to extrapolate from one moment. What I show you, if I were to turn the camera around, that's happening in this office in Kitchener, Ontario, is not the way the majority of Canadians live. But the Model United Nations asks us to think about that, to become more engaged, to become more of the world around us. And that builds social advocacy. Someone once said, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. That if you're engaged with the world, because there are so many pressing problems, because there are so many ways we could do better, I can't be aware of that and not take action. That global engagement is the first step to social advocacy. But the next step is, what do I do with that advocacy? Forgive me for using North American examples, but the NBA, the National Basketball Association, is in the middle of its playoffs right now. And a couple of weeks back, because of some of the concerns of racial equity in America, many of the teams just said, we're not playing, we're out. And it was a powerful statement. It was a first step to bringing a sense of awareness and advocacy to an issue that many people had ignored. The challenge became the next day. Were they supposed to go back to playing the next day? Were they supposed to wait for a week? Were they holding out for the owners or for the politicians to do something active before they went back to play? And it became a challenge for them. Advocacy starts with engagement, but it needs to move forward with a plan. And the Model United Nations provides an experience that encourages that kind of planning. Because I don't just learn what the issue is, what my country is about, but I also need to think about, how do I problem solve? How do I move this forward? What treaties, conventions are already out there? What's the missing piece? Can I think creatively about how to respond to these problems? I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but one of the great opportunities is that we have people at our simulations who are in this world. They represent NGOs, they're politicians, they come in, and very often they will say that the resolutions that the students come up with in Model United Nations are far better than many of the things that come to their tables, because their world is so filled with all of the baggage that comes with getting to that position. You are creative naturally. You are flexible naturally. And it allows that social advocacy to grow into an intercultural competency, to be aware of not just my own point of view, but the points of view that surround us throughout our own countries. I can't imagine, for all of the students listening right now, you all think the same way. So even in Colombia, there are different cultural experiences, different beliefs, but then around the world. And it doesn't mean I have to agree with everybody, but I need to be able to come to a table with them to recognize their culture and to be able to engage with them to move forward. That's what characterizes global leadership. It's that competency which we pursue. But as my students will often tell you, I'm talking way too much right now. So let's have a quick word from one of my past delegates and a chap who's won multiple outstanding delegate awards. And Bear with me because the video is not loading. Sorry for the technology. With your permission, I'm going to leave it there because my fear is if I start changing the settings so the video can play, that will wipe the whole thing out.
That is okay, Jonathan. Don't worry.
Okay. But what Matthew says, and I really wanted you to hear his voice say it, is that this is fun. That there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of skill that develops here, but it is ultimately fun. That being around other young people who are enthusiastic, who are creative, who are filled with passion and want to do well in the world, not just for themselves, but for everybody, is fun. So let's talk a little bit then briefly about the skills that this builds. And these are skills that transcend not just the Model United Nations, but set you up for success academically as well. Now, these aren't an accidental outcome. They're an intentional goal of the Model United Nations. But we do need to recognize that global leadership doesn't rest only with the educated. Malala Yousafzai was the Pakistani activist and educator, as well as the youngest Nobel laureate ever. But she was only in high school when she rose to prominence. She didn't need a university education to change the world. But we do know that education helps. In fact, we also know that elementary education, especially for young women, is the silver bullet that drives social justice, economic growth, and personal independence. But let's come back to research, because this is the first of the skills that are necessary to succeed in Model United Nations simulations. Delegates need to be able to understand the country they're representing so they can do it accurately and fairly. They need to know its demography, who are its people, its political structure, how does it make its decisions, its economy, how does it drive wealth, its domestic and foreign policies, as well as its history with a specific issue. And that can include past statements from leaders or governments, treaties they've signed, declarations, etc. And so a case study here would be Canada's issues with a trans-provincial oil pipeline. See, Canada's a big country, it's a federation, but it's broken up into 10 individual autonomous provinces and 3 territories, each with its own government, each with its own responsibilities. On top of that, we have an unfortunate relationship with our native peoples. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but Canada's experience with its Indigenous population is a dark one. And so here we had a trans-provincial oil pipeline that the federal government supported, that one province wanted because of the revenue it would generate, that another province didn't want because of the environmental harm, and all the while it was crossing the Wet'suwet'en lands. And the Wet'suwet'en are a tribe, an Indigenous group, who have a sovereign arrangement with the government of Canada. So this is a domestic issue. Why are we talking about it here? Well, it had huge influence on Canada's perspective on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. Of all of the member nations of the UN, all but I believe 3 signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Persons: Australia, the United States, and Canada. And it's not accidental that those 3 nations are still managing legal, social, and economic concerns with their First Peoples. An Indigenous woman in Canada has a 50% higher chance of being murdered, missing, or reported missing, or abused. Suicide rates amongst Indigenous peoples are 25% higher than the rest of the population. Substance abuse is 30% higher than the rest of the population. And it is in many cases a direct result of the poverty that is experienced by these groups. And so for Canada to advocate for the rights of Indigenous persons in other communities, they would have to recognize first that they, as a government, have a responsibility to their own. And so if I'm representing Canada in an issue like this, then that research becomes critical to me in accurately and fairly representing my delegation. I need to look at what it means to bring forward the voices of people who don't have an institutional voice. I need to recognize the use of force, very recent force, on the part of police and the military to suppress Aboriginal protests or the blockades of Indigenous groups on their territory. And I wonder if that resonates. I wonder if you could think, just for a moment, of a similar experience in Colombia. What might it be like to research deeply that question rather than just to rely on your immediate understanding? Once we've done the research, we then need to do the analysis. We need to think critically. And so delegates need to be able to evaluate a global issue. They need to understand the domestic and the international causes and consequences, as well as recognizing the existing alliances and blocks and the investment of a variety of transnational partners around the world. In that last example, the holding company that wants to build the pipeline is based in the United States, which brings even yet another layer of concern. A good example here is racial equity. Again, I've commented on Canada's ill treatment of Indigenous persons, but it's historically been hostile to immigration and demographic change, particularly from areas of the world it sees as developing. I mean, I teach history. 1923, Canada passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was no making bones about it. We historically said we don't want people from China. And there was no sense that that should cause shame or embarrassment. And so this bias then, this bias towards immigration from Western Europe and from the United States, this bias away from immigration from countries that were seen as being problems to integrate, resulted in systemic views and racialized communities in Canada. In the city of Toronto, not far from where I live today, there was a policing policy that said, if you thought a person was acting suspiciously, a police officer could stop that person on the street and immediately ask for identification so that they could prove they had a purpose to be there. Now, this goes against our Constitution. It goes against our understandings of freedom of movement, privacy of the person, and the rights to access in terms of police contact. But it was done anyway because it was seen as keeping people safe. When they looked at the statistics, 80% of the people who were carded, who were asked for their identification, were Black. 17% were Latino, and then the other 3% were typically from other racialized communities. But there's nuances here, because the other part of this is the sense of history versus story. So go back to the research. When I research, it's easy to go to documents. I can look at the record of the Government of Canada, of the United Nations, of the specific committees we're doing. But when I think critically, I have to understand that many of the stories aren't a part of those histories. I need to look at the stories of those communities who traditionally have not been given an institutional voice. And thank goodness we've started to do this, I would say, over the last 10 years. But I need to understand the principle of intersectionality. I need to understand the economic determinants that drive this racial inequity. I need to understand the perspective of people, a perspective I might disagree with, but argues only for merit-based admission to Canada, meaning you already speak English, you have a skilled trade that we value, you have documentation that we want to admit. And so if I were bringing this forward because we were looking perhaps in the United Nations Commission on Refugees, and I was representing Canada and someone proposed increasing the intake of refugees, I would need to be able to think critically about all of those factors that had emerged in my research so as to engage. And again, I wonder if that might resonate with you, if there might be an issue locally in Colombia that might parallel this. I believe collaboration, though, is the most important skill. Collaboration marked by creativity and flexibility. It's often said you don't need to be the smartest or the most expert person in the room, and thank goodness for that in my case. But you do need to know how to cooperate, to challenge people, to work towards the identification and the pursuit of common goals. Certainly when I represent a particular delegation in the United Nations, I have my own ends, I have my own outcomes. There are things I want to achieve, but I cannot achieve them alone. It's not how the UN works. So I need to be able to work with partners and competitors in order to develop effective solutions. And that's collaboration. It's the process of identifying those stakeholders and the common points upon which we can agree. Canada has massive issues with resources. We have the largest amount of fresh water in a world faced with overwhelming drought. We have some of the most significant mineral extractions in the world and large but complicated, and by complicated, I mean disastrous for the environment, oil reserves. Much of that land is owned by Indigenous communities, but the extraction is offered to multinational corporations. Those resources aren't equally distributed, they're easily commodified, and they have huge implications for climate change that goes beyond national borders. So how would we start working then to create some sense of commonality? Well, we can talk about dollars, we can talk about money. So certainly the corporations want to generate profit and revenue, but the local, the provincial, and the federal governments also want to see some of that revenue in tax dollars so that they can build a social safety net in their country. The Indigenous communities, who I mentioned earlier, are often crippled by poverty at a disproportionate rate to the rest of Canada, would like to see dollars so that they can bring their communities forward. They can put their people to work. They can build social services in their own reserves. And so then we said, well, yeah, but now we've got the dollar against the climate. And I think one of the interesting things that's starting to emerge is we can no longer look at capitalism solely about generating revenue. Because if I generate revenue in a way that is in the short, medium, or even long term detrimental to the environment, that's not sustainable. It's one thing to say that I can extract all of this oil in the next 10 years and make a ton of money. But what happens when it's gone? And so looking at that question of sustainability, particularly in terms of environmental concern, becomes another common point between those different groups. And then finally, the question of autonomy. Who gets to say? If I'm putting up the money as the corporation, do I get to have the final say? If it's happening on my land as a native person, do I get the final say? If it's happening in my country as the government, do I get the final say? Well, are there ways to share that autonomy and to recognize the different vested interests? The final skill is communication. And delegates need to be able to express their ideas in a way that's respectful, in a way that follows the diplomatic norms of the Model United Nations. There are specific ways of speaking, ways of introducing yourself. You can't use first-person pronouns. I am Canada, I am not Jonathan from Canada. But we also need to reflect those cultural norms. It happens independently when I write. There are position papers typically before you meet. It happens orally when we're in a committee, we're debating, we're discussing. And then it's written collaboratively when you come together with other partners to write resolutions, declarations, conventions, treaties, laws. And this is where the ability to speak, the ability to think on your feet, to communicate, can make up for, in some cases, a position that isn't as tenable nationally. That if I have a country, if I'm representing China, and one of the issues is China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population, there's a pretty demonstrable record that says that that isn't good. But a skilled delegate, because of their communication, may still be able to have their outcomes realized in a committee because of their ability to convince. And so a quick example here of a massive question is decolonization. Historically, Canada was a product of colonization. We were a colony of the British Empire, but we were also an active participant in it. As the senior colony in the British Empire, in particular, white Canadians, English-speaking Canadians, were placed in an economically more advantaged position. And so there was this traditional sense in Canada that there was the English-speaking and then the French-speaking population and then the minority of everybody else. But this ruling community is changing. There are quickly becoming a majority of non-English speakers as a first language. And that's fundamentally changing our communities. It's fundamentally changing the way in which we relate to each other, the language we use, not just the language English, French, Spanish, but the language in terms of how we address one another, how we invite one another to dialogue. And again, I'm sure you could come up with an issue in Colombia that would parallel this. I was going to give one of the final words to Jake. Matthew's great. Jake is hilarious, so I really apologize. But Jake was going to encourage you to get involved, to participate, to not just say, hey, yeah, that sounds fine, but why does it matter to me? To think about ways in which you two could engage. See, in Waterloo Catholic, we have school teams that meet regularly to develop the skills and to discuss the events. We began as clubs, but the challenge there was we just got together. We didn't really focus on the skills, so we started thinking of it like a football team. We get together, we meet, we have outcomes. These are the markers we want to hit. This is how we see ourselves getting better. These are the events that we're working towards, and we practice. We're fortunate enough to have a course dedicated to international diplomacy, and we use the skills of the Model United Nations in there. It's a really interesting approach. When I think back to my time as a student, the things I found most interesting and where I learned the most were in the practical application of the knowledge. I'll read books all day, I'm fine. But when we could get together and debate, to discuss, to practice in simulations, it gave me ownership of those skills, it gave me confidence in my ability, and it developed my competence in doing those things. And so it's really exciting for me to be able to teach a course where I would say 10% of the time is spent in a traditional classroom, where I would teach a particular lesson. Here's a committee in the UN, this is the way it works. 50% of the time is spent with students, working with students, learning from each other in preparation. And then 40% of the time physically in practice, meeting as representatives of different countries and arguing about issues. We have local simulations that our school board offers, and so our schools compete against other schools. We go to participate in other simulations offered by universities, and we have great connections with the academic population. One quick plug I will say is that next year, things were a little different this year, but next year, our school board intends to host a large-scale international event, and there'll be opportunities for delegations from countries such as Colombia to participate. You could participate digitally. We're getting better at this, whether it's over a platform like Zoom, or there are cultural experiences where you could come to visit, be a part of our school for a week or two, go to local sites, etc. But in closing, I will say, as a former participant on behalf of the hundreds of students in our school board who do regularly participate, it is a fantastic opportunity. Some of my fondest memories as a student and as a teacher are from simulations and teams like this. I enjoyed class, I played lots of sports, but the skills and experience of the Model United Nations have played the biggest part in forming the person and the teacher that I am today. And so with that, I'll close. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to respond. And if not, I wish you a terrific day.
Jonathan, thank you very much for all the information. I think it was quite an interesting conference or information you gave us. We had different teachers and leaders from schools watching at the conference, and actually I was having some chats about how excited they are in terms of future possible collaboration. I personally think that it was a great a great perspective that you told us today, and the approach you have in terms of all the international things that are involved in this, give the students a wider view of the world, or at least of how can they analyze different situations. The comparison between Canada and Colombia, and I think it brings us a lot of questions to our mind in terms of that we don't need to see only Colombia, but also the rest of the world. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for the questions, but I am pretty sure we're going to start closer collaborations with these schools that belong to Red Call. So Jonathan, I wanted to deeply thank you for this time and for sharing this with us. I apologize for the technical issues we had at the beginning. As you said, that's a work in progress, and we'll be evolving on that. So thank you very much for your participation and for sharing this with us, and also your team, Dan and Jessica, who I know they're also connected. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.